Hello there, everybody. Whilst going through my list of questions for the dry dock, I noticed an awful lot of them consisted of this ship versus that ship. So, to allow the dry dock to be more about sort of naval history and technical aspects, I thought we'd do a special where we try and wrap up a lot of those sort of versus arguments all in one go. Much like with the alternate history bit, it's sort of if you don't like ship versus ship versus discussions, then you don't have to listen, and it's all in one place. And if you do, well, now you have sort of half an hour plus of exactly that. So let's get on with it. Now, before we start, just a couple of baseline assumptions. We're going to assume that each ship is competently crewed, unless there is a very good reason not to assume this. We're also going to assume that the ships are in relatively decent serviceable condition. And where one ship is significantly older than the other, we are going to take it from a time period where both ships were contemporary. And if the older ship had been refitted, then obviously we'll use that as a baseline. If the ship is a hypothetical one that was never built, then we'll make some reasonable assumptions about a potential refit based on the historical refits given to ships of that navy. So the first one that's asked is by Jerem Cervantes, and he asks how a battle would go between the North Carolina and Nagato classes. So a quick initial comparison using the refitted Nagato class statistics shows that actually these ships on paper seem very well matched. They both have a 12-inch belt, they both have approximately a 5 to 6-inch deck, they both have similar secondary batteries in terms of numbers and caliber. North Carolina has a couple more guns, and its guns on the secondary battery are in turrets, which gives it a superior range of fire compared to the casement batteries of the Nagato class, but conversely, losing one turret loses two guns, whereas losing a casement mount only loses one gun for the Nagato. The North Carolina is about 3 knots faster, which is just about enough to give it a tactical advantage. And finally, the main talking point, the North Carolina has a main battery of 9 16-inch 45 Mark 6 guns in 3 triple turrets, and the Nagato has a main battery of 8 16.1-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. North Carolina therefore has the greater broadside firepower and the greater forward firepower, albeit that the loss of a single turret takes both ships down to 6 guns. The loss of 2 turrets gives Nagato a slight superiority of 4 guns versus 3. Now, in terms of the shells that the guns will be slinging, the North Carolina's guns carry about 3 kilograms more explosive each, just over 18 kilograms bursting charge versus 15 kilograms on the Nagato class, so each individual shell hit is going to do slightly more damage. However, the big deciding factor comes in armor penetration. Basically, the Nagato does not have an immune zone against the shells of the North Carolina class. Meanwhile, the available data suggests that the main belt of the North Carolina class is immune to the Nagato shells above maybe 17 to 18,000 yards. Now, on paper, this would suggest that the North Carolina can sit at extreme long range, as many US Navy fans like to point out, and shell the Nagato to death without any real chance of receiving a significant hit itself. However, I would point out that during the World War II period, the US Navy did tests using the USS Iowa, which obviously had the latest guns and the latest fire control systems, and against a target the size of an Iowa class, which is obviously a little bit bigger than both of the ships that we're talking about here, when you're talking about extreme long-range engagements, i.e. sort of 30,000 yards and up, the percentage of hits scored against a broadside target was only 2.7%. That means that with a 9-gun broadside, at 30,000 yards, you're looking at maybe 1 in 4 salvos landing a single hit, assuming that you've already found the range, which really in battleship combat, unless you score an absolute golden BB hit like Bismarck did on Hood, it's basically not even worth considering that low level of accuracy. However, at the outer edges of what could be dubbed practical battle range, sort of 20,000 yards and just over, the hit percentage was, in those tests I just mentioned, was 10.5%. And that's kind of approximates to mathematically about 1 guaranteed to hit per salvo, which is significantly better. And obviously the vagaries of war, and once you've found the range, you're probably looking at more and more hits as you begin to dial it in. So whilst the idea of the North Carolina just sitting at 30,000 yards and pummeling away probably isn't going to happen, it can, however, hold the range at about 20,000 yards or just over, and at that range its main belt will protect it against the Nagato's main guns. The reverse is not true, and it has a fairly good chance of actually scoring meaningful and repeated hits. Therefore, the battle between these two ships in open ocean is very likely to go the North Carolina's way, simply because it can hold the range and just pummel away the Nagato at that sort of 20 to 23,000 yard bracket without the Nagato being able to do much in response, since there are no major design flaws in either ship that would suggest an outcome otherwise. Now, you have a chap called Ryan Zuckley to blame-thank for the next series of versus matchups, as he suggested a whole load in various videos. So we're going to start off with the N3 versus the Tillman IV-2. Well, this one is fairly short and fairly obvious. The Tillman IV-2 outmasses the N3 by 30,000 tons. It carries 6 more 18-inch guns, and it's 2 knots faster. Now, well, that 2 knots is probably not enough in the grand scheme of things to allow it to tactically dictate the field. And the simple fact of the matter is it's effectively got a sort of a 18-inch battle cruiser's worth of guns extra. And with that 30,000 tons more mass to absorb damage, it's really only going to go the Tillman IV-2's way. I mean, this thing, remember, we rated it as being able to beat the Japanese A150 and the H-44, so the N3, which is a substantially less capable design, it doesn't really stand much of a chance. The only thing the N3 has going in its favour is that its armour belt is sloped at 25 degrees, which at longer ranges, theoretically, actually makes it possible that its armour belt might reject the 18-inch shells of the Tillman, assuming it gets hit in the armour belt, whereas the Tillman's more slab-sided 16-inch belt isn't really capable of resisting the N3's firepower at any practical battle range. So there is a marginal edge case at the outer edges of practical battle range, i.e. in the low to mid 20,000s of yards, where it's theoretically possible that an N3 might weather the Tillman IV-2's barrage of fire and be able to land some pretty nasty hits of its own, at which point then, in theory, it would go the N3's way, because, yeah, if you get hit by full salve 18-inch shells, it doesn't matter whether you're N3 or IV-2, if they go through the armour, you're pretty much stuffed. So, yeah, by most metrics, the IV-2 has a pretty overwhelming advantage, with a slight edge case of things could possibly go wrong in the longer range engagement, which could hand the N3 the match. But advantage IV-2. You then have the USS Texas, the French battleship Bretagne, and HMS Iron Duke. I guess that's a three-way. Now, this one is actually quite interesting. All 3 ships have a top speed of between 20 and 21 knots, so no tactical advantage to anyone on that score. They all have the same turret layout of 5 twin turrets, 2 superfiring forward, 2 superfiring aft, and 1 in the centre. The main guns are all within a fraction of each other of the same calibre. The French ship has 13.4-inch guns, the British ship 13.5-inch guns, and the American ship has 14-inch guns. The individual guns in the British main battery are slightly heavier, being 6-inch guns instead of the 5 to 5.4-inch guns of the other two. However, it only has 12 of them versus the 20-plus in the other 2 ships. And for what it's worth, all 3 ships have 4 torpedo tubes. However, things start to diverge quite quickly beyond this. The Iron Duke and Texas both carry a 12-inch main belt. The French ship only carries a 9.8-inch belt. Now, obviously, engagement ranges for this sort of World War I era fight are significantly less than a World War II era fight, but the guns are commensurately also less powerful. This is actually quite a critical failing, as it means that the British and American ships can penetrate the French battleship around 14 to 15,000 yards, whilst the French ship is not capable of penetrating either of its opponent's main belts until it's down to 10,000 yards. So you're talking about maybe a third of the practical engagement range where the French ship can't actually hurt its opponents through the main belt, at least. That, I think, rules the French ship out of this particular little competition. It's just going to get hit at those kind of ranges, and Jutland showed you could quite reliably get hits at those kind of ranges and take a ship down without having to close to within 10,000 yards. So yeah, French ships out on grounds of being too underprotected. So that leaves Texas and Iron Duke. Now, whilst Iron Duke showed remarkable accuracy for a battleship of the period at Jutland, and the American ships that showed up in 1917 showed remarkably poor accuracy for the time in exercises, we're going to assume for a moment that the gunnery crews are of equal competence. Now, in terms of shells, it might surprise you to learn that although the Texas is rocking the 14-inch gun and the British ship is rocking the 13.5-inch gun, the British ship is actually carrying a slightly heavier bursting charge per shell. The APC Mark IIIA shell and the Mark 8 AP shell on Texas carry a similar 15 kilogram or thereabout bursting charge, but the British ship also has the potential to be carrying a 20 kilogram bursting charge APC Mark 1A shell, and it also has the rather interesting CPC shell with a 53 kilogram bursting charge, albeit that this sort of halfway house between AP and HE would only be useful at very close ranges. So we'll discount the CPC, but the Iron Duke is likely to be carrying shells that do as much or more damage per hit. Armour penetration is about similar, so barring critical hits to the outer parts of the ship's superstructure, etc., you're talking about 10,000 yards for either side to be penetrating the other. But this is where a number of smaller soft factors come in. The British gun has a slightly higher rate of fire, not by much, but it's 1.5 to 2 rounds a minute as opposed to 1.25 to 1.75 rounds a minute on the American ship. The Texas has the older unmodified cage masts, which are going to affect its accuracy as the fire control is not quite as stable as the British tripod mast. And finally, the Texas uses the older vertical triple expansion engines as opposed to the turbines of Iron Duke. This means that Iron Duke can reliably and smoothly keep up its top speed, whilst Texas is going to suffer some from vibration problems and is not going to be able to hold its maximum speed for anywhere near as long. And in a prolonged engagement, that, especially combined with the sort of slightly flexible nature of the cage mast, is going to have a significant effect on the ship's accuracy and maneuverability. So overall, the battle looks like it's going to favour the Iron Duke as the winner. However, there is one factor where the Texas claws something back, which is that with both sides having to close to 10,000 yards or less to actually hurt each other through their main belt, this is well within range of the secondary battery of both ships, and the Texas has a main battery that is significantly larger, 21 5-inch guns versus 12 6-inch guns on the Iron Duke. So it's possible that Texas might, using a sort of hail of fire, do something relatively critical on the outside of the citadel, like say knock out the bridge, knock out fire control, something of that nature. And if it gets those kind of hits in, it could potentially cripple Iron Duke's fighting capabilities. Of course, Iron Duke potentially could do the same with its own guns, but there's fewer of them, so statistically it's slightly less likely. Therefore, whilst the main battle factors tend to weight it very heavily in the Iron Duke's favour, this additional factor in favour of Texas probably makes me say maybe 65-35 in favour of Iron Duke. So Iron Duke's still winning, but Texas has the potential to pull off a win within the realms of plausibility, as opposed to, say, the N3 versus Tillman IV-2, which is very much an outside chance. Next up is Vanguard versus Scharnhorst. That one's pretty easy, I'm afraid. I mean, Vanguard's rocking heavier guns, albeit slightly fewer of them than Duke of York did. It's got an armour layout that's similar to Duke of York, and Duke of York pretty much overwhelmed Scharnhorst. So, yeah, I can't really see Scharnhorst pulling a win in this situation off in, well, any situation barring the Vanguard getting stupid enough to get into torpedo range. So, yeah, Vanguard wins that one. That was quick and easy. And the last one in the battery from Ryan was HMS Agincourt versus the Imperial Japanese Navy ship Fuso. So in this one, Agincourt is a couple of knots slower than Fuso. Its guns are significantly smaller. You've got 12-inch versus 14-inch, and it's also got significantly less belt armor. It's got 9 inches of belt versus 12 inches on Fuso. So it's kind of almost like the French Bretagne in the previous discussions about Iron Duke, Texas, and Bretagne, except possibly worse. Now, Agincourt's guns can actually punch through Fuso's belt at surprising range. Believe it or not, for 12-inch guns, they have quite a scary level of penetration. You're talking about sort of 13,000-ish yards. However, in the upper range bracket for World War One, so beyond that up to about 20,000 yards, Fuso's guns can just punch through Agincourt at leisure. The only other thing Agincourt carries in its favour is the fact it's carrying 7 turrets, so total of 14 guns, as opposed to Fuso's, again, not terrible, 6 twin turrets for 12 guns, so a couple more guns on Agincourt's side. But let's face it, realistically, this is only going to go one way. Fuso has just about the speed to keep the range at what it wants. Fuso has the firepower to sit at the range that it wants beyond the effective range of the 12-inch guns and pummel the Agincourt to death. And the only way that Agincourt really is coming out of this in any good shape is if it just plasters Fuso at long distance with mass fire from its 12-inch guns, and basically hopes that just by sheer weight of fire to break something and force Fuso to close in for better accuracy. But realistically, yeah, this one's going to Fuso. So Sean Shee asks a question that inevitably leads us back to the Bismarck. So he wants to redo the Bismarck battle, but instead of Hood and Prince of Wales, you have USS Alabama and maybe Repulse or Renown going up against Tirpitz and Prince Eugen. Or, even more interestingly, Tirpitz and Bismarck coming up against Alabama and South Dakota. This is actually far more plausible than it might otherwise sound, because both Alabama and South Dakota, as he notes, were at various points assigned to the UK to guard against raids by Tirpitz, although obviously not in 1941, when Tirpitz wasn't actually finished. So let's look at the first scenario, which is USS Alabama, and I'm going to say Renown, because Renown seems to have done more work in the North Sea, going up against Tirpitz and Prince Eugen, although obviously this postdates 1941, because Tirpitz isn't built yet. Now, for this particular matchup, I almost want to award you the Battle of Sinop Medal for cruel and unusual punishment. There's no way the Germans are coming out of this intact. I mean, Renown is a good gunnery ship. It's a battle cruiser, and by this point possibly edging into fast battleship territory, versus an Admiral Hipper-class cruiser. That fight's going to last all of 5 minutes. And Tirpitz versus the Alabama, well, the Alabama has one more gun. It has 16-inch guns with heavy AP shells versus 15-inch guns on Tirpitz, and Tirpitz shares many of the same design weaknesses that Bismarck does. Alabama's going to win that fight, although it's going to take slightly longer than Renown versus Prince Eugen, but Renown's going to join in once it's finished off Prince Eugen, so yeah, German force going down very quickly there. Now, Bismarck and Tirpitz versus Alabama and South Dakota is not quite the same level of curb stomp as the previous battle, mainly due to the fact that, well, the second pair is going to last, that battle's going to last more than 5 minutes. However, it's still a case of, well, the South Dakota class is measurably superior to the Bismarck class in terms of total firepower, as we discussed previously. Now, whilst both sides can actually penetrate each other's armor belt out to a surprising distance. The distance at which the South Dakota starts becoming immune to the Bismarck's fire is actually within reasonable battle range as practiced in World War II. And we also have those design faults that actually killed the Bismarck, things like fire control systems exposed above the armor deck, which, as with the Rodney engagement, mean that Bismarck and Tirpitz are likely to lose battle effectiveness relatively early on. So, not as one-sided as the first one, but the two South Dakotas are going to take this relatively comfortably. Now, K-Wolf-X actually asked a similar question, which was USS Washington versus Tirpitz, specifically in the context of the PQ-17 convoy, where Washington and some escorts were nearby, and Tirpitz was thought to have come out, and that's caused the convoy to scatter. So let's have a look at that one, because Washington is sort of one step down. So we've got the Admiral Hipper and a few destroyers versus the Washington's escorts. It's pretty much a wash. I think really we need to focus just on the battleship engagement. Now, Washington is a North Carolina class battleship, so it carries similar firepower to the South Dakota classes in the previous little conversation. However, its main belt and armor scheme is designed to resist significantly smaller guns. Bear in mind this was a ship that was originally designed with 14-inch guns that were swapped at the last minute, so it is not proof against its own main battery, and it's therefore more vulnerable to Tirpitz's 15-inch fire. Now, it still does possess guns that hit harder and one more of them, but Tirpitz possesses significantly more displacement to possibly soak that up. And for all the weaknesses in the Bismarck class design, they did demonstrate good early accuracy, which is probably the most important part of a fight. So with this one, I think it's probably too close to call a decisive winner. North Carolina has a firepower advantage, but the Tirpitz, if it gets in some good early hits, which has a relatively decent chance of doing, has pretty much the same chance of scoring critical damage on the Washington as the vice versa. So in this case, neither side really has a practical immune zone against the other, and I'm just going to go with saying that coin toss, maybe slight advantage to the Washington, but I wouldn't want to call that. Bizarrely enough, although we did kind of dismiss the escorts, it's probably going to come down, I would imagine, to which escorts actually come out on top in the escort fight and lend their sort of firepower to try and tip the balance, especially if one or two destroyers break through and stick a torpedo or two into the respective ships. Daniel Volborth asks a question that's not quite the same as what we've been covering, but is similar. What if a G3 battlecruiser had been in Forced rather than the Repulse? Now, of course, the primary thing that actually killed Forced was a lack of air cover, but second to that, as I covered in the old video on the sinking of Forced, the lack of tracer in the guns, which was really bizarre, was the other contributing factor, basically because without tracer, the enemy pilots have little to no idea that they're actually being shot at, so they just kind of hold their course even through really dense AA barrages. Whereas the psychological effect of having streams and streams of tracer at you, even if you don't actually get hit, actually serves to break up and demoralize pilots, which cause attacks to be staggered and such, which makes them more survivable. But anyway, so in this hypothetical, we're talking about a time where maybe a G3 or G3s have been built, whether or not they've replaced Renown and Repulse or whatever, but doesn't make much odds. So the G3 is an older ship, much like Renown and Repulse. However, they're a lot more significant capital ship, and they probably would have received updates, actually similar to what Renown did. So let's have a quick look at a theoretical G3 refit. Now, I believe that this particular modernisation plan is slightly ungenerous to the G3, because if you look at this, now yes, it's a World of Warships poster, but it's accurate to the layout of the armament. On the much smaller Queen Elizabeth class, they managed to replace the secondary battery with a total of 10 twin 4-inch anti-aircraft guns. So if you're replacing the secondary battery on the much larger G3 class, you're going to get a lot more of them. So you're taking out these twin 6-inch turrets. I believe you'd probably get 3, maybe 4 either side of the superstructure, and then probably another 3 or 4 per side on the stern. So you're probably talking anywhere from 12 to possibly 18 twin 4-inch mounts, which is a surprisingly heavy anti-aircraft battery. Now that, combined with the G3's speed and torpedo protection, and of course any light and medium AA that they stick on there with that massive stern area, which certainly has a lot of potential for development as an anti-aircraft position, that might give the British ships enough AA firepower to take down some more planes, which then in turn might actually give them a chance to survive. And it's not a great improvement because, as I say, the main thing they need is air cover. However, if we want to assume that the British have got a G3, we might as well also give them some tracer. And if you've got tracer from the potential anti-aircraft battery of a modernised G3 plus the Prince of Wales, that actually stands a relatively decent chance of breaking up the Japanese attacks to a degree that the attack is survivable. Now, I don't necessarily think that they're going to get out there scot-free. They're probably going to take a couple of hits, but I think that 4Z might have survived long enough to beat a retreat back to Singapore and get some repairs. And finally, for this special episode, the Maril 005 asks, the Algerie class heavy cruiser versus Admiral Hipper in a duel. So we're looking at what's widely considered to be one of the best treaty heavy cruisers versus an ostensibly treaty heavy cruiser that cheated. So, well, yeah, that's the Hipper class for you. Anyway, let's look at the stats. So speed-wise, neither ship is particularly faster than the other, so there's no tactical advantage to be had there. Both sides possess 4 twin 8-inch guns in twin super firing positions forward and aft. The Algerie and the Hipper both possess similar secondary batteries. So Hipper's primary secondary battery, you've got 12 4.1-inch guns, and the Algerie you have 12 guns that are fractionally smaller, but near enough as makes no difference the same. So similar secondary battery, both in 6 twin mountings. Algerie has 2 triple torpedo launchers. Hipper has 4 triple torpedo launchers, so Hipper has twice as many torpedoes to bring to the fight. The main difference between the two, however, is that Algerie has a 4.7-inch main belt combined with a 3-inch deck. The Hipper has a 3.1-inch belt with a much thinner deck, albeit that the Hipper does go for the turtleback effect. Now, this does open up a slight advantage for the French cruiser, as its belt armour is actually capable of resisting the German shells down to maybe about 15,000 yards. So in that sort of 15 to 20,000 yard range, which would be kind of a World War II heavy cruiser's long range bracket, the French ship can actually resist incoming German fire, the German ship less so. However, what really tips the scales for me is the shells themselves. The German shell, the APC L-4.4, carries a 2.3 kilogram bursting charge. That's fairly pathetic, to be honest. Whereas the French APC M1927 shell carries just over 8 kilograms of explosive. So you're talking 3 to 4 times the explosive per shell for the French ship as compared to the German ship. So the French ship has this slight advantage in that it has an immune zone that it can realistically sit in, albeit it's going to have to contest that. The main thing is when both sides hit each other, and assuming they hit each other at roughly the same rate, which is reasonable given all the other factors being relatively equal, the French ship's delivering 3 to 4 times the explosive per hit, as compared to the Hipper, so it's going to do a lot more damage a lot faster. So in this respect, I'm going to have to hand this fight relatively convincingly to the French Algerie class. And so with that, I'm going to round up this special episode. I hope it's cleared a number of questions that have probably been outstanding for quite a while. Hope you enjoyed it, and we shall see you again on the next episode of whatever it is you happen to be watching. Thanks very much.